Hi everyone in Science and Values. This lecture is going to be about Chapter 3 from the Elliot reading for this week. Have you assigned to read pages 40 to 48. The title of the chapter is How Should We Study It? And Elliot always intentionally, the titles of his chapters are very intentionally worded to indicate where in his argument about transparency, engagement, and representativeness, about how those can be incorporated better and used to make the value influences of scientists on their research just more obvious. And so the title, How Should We Study It? So we've the previous chapters was what should we study? So we've selected a topic. The question now is, now that we've selected a topic, what is the best method to use to try and get the results that we would like to get? But how should we study the topic we've chosen? So that's obviously an important part of any research methodology. Is you need a topic, but you also need a way to study the topic. And there might be a variety of methods that you can use. And so Elliot begins this chapter with an example called golden rice, or it was dubbed golden rice. And quite simply, and this may be something that all of you are familiar with, you may have not even needed Elliot to tell you about this example, but essentially, the idea was there are large portions of the world, millions of people, particularly in Asia, that are malnourished, that suffer from a lack of a particular kind of vitamin, and that there are. This is not an easy problem to solve. Malnourishment and underfed populations is not an easy problem to solve on a global scale. And so at a certain point, some research was discovered that could genetically alter the seeds of rice plants that could allow them to produce more vitamin A than they already do. And given that rice is such a staple food in so many parts of the world, this seemed like a quick and easy way for these individuals to get the nutrients that they were otherwise lacking. And so in this way, you're kind of working with the diet that you're not having to introduce new foods into the diet. You're simply working with a food that they already consume in great quantities, and you're simply altering the nutrient composition of that food. And if you could do that, it seems like it has the potential to certainly not solve, that's too strong of a word, but alleviate or at least make better some of the problems. And so he introduces this example at the beginning of this chapter to indicate that here we have a problem of malnourishment, of food shortage. We have this problem. The question is, we want to study this problem. We've selected this problem to study, and the question is, how should we study it, and how might we fix it? And so this is proposed as one way to try and solve the problem. This is one proposed method. And this method is coming from what we might call big agriculture. Somebody like Monsanto, companies that are engaged in the genetic modification of plants and seeds. And so that's one method. But is it the only method? Is this the only way of, we have this problem, right? We've decided on the problem that we're going to study, food shortage worldwide. We have a particular perspective about how to study it. Change the nutrient composition of the rice plants, and we have a quick and easy way to try and start to alleviate these concerns. Now, before we get to some of the larger concerns with this particular way of studying this problem, Elliot mentions another kind of metaphor, and he introduces this on page 42. And I just want to just go through that briefly to try to show what the problem actually is here. So Elliot recalls a well-known story or anecdote of blind men who are trying to figure out what an elephant is. And so all of these men are blind and they are approaching an elephant. They're kind of walking around, they're feeling different parts of the elephant. One, touches the tail, one touches the trunk, one might touch the legs. I don't know, but they're all touching different parts of the elephant. And the thing is, to each of those men, because they are blind, whatever they are touching is the elephant. They're not aware of the other ways of engaging with the animal. They're not aware of the other possibilities for what the elephant could be. And so this is supposed to illustrate, in some ways, it's supposed to illustrate, one, that there are multiple ways to approach a problem. The blind men each represents a different perspective on the elephant. So that's kind of the positive lesson to take from this, is that there are I don't want to say 4 or 5. I'm thinking in terms of the elephant, there could be more than that. But in the case of the elephant, maybe we'd say there's 4 or 5 different ways to study the elephant and to figure out what the elephant is. So that's the positive side. The negative sort of lesson to draw from this is that how limiting one perspective is. How limiting it is to say that the tail is the elephant. From that perspective, because you're kind of, again, it's a metaphor, but because you're kind of, in some ways, you're blinded by your own perspective about what the elephant is. And that perspective is kind of what you're locked into. And so that is part of the danger with this metaphor, is that it implies, one, that there are multiple ways to study a problem. It also implies that somebody who is so consumed with their own methods and their own perspective and their own values will remain locked in that perspective and not remain open to the positive lesson that there are multiple ways to study it. And so let's go back then to the golden rice example. From the perspective of big agriculture, how should we study this problem of food shortage? How should we study it? We should study it using the most efficient method possible. And so there's clearly an economic incentive here, an economic motive for big agriculture to solve this problem. From the economic perspective, the values that are associated with this are efficiency. The primary value is efficiency. This seems like a really quick and easy way to solve a problem. So from the economic perspective, there's just kind of, there is a problem and it needs to be solved as quickly as possible, with as few resources potentially as possible, so that you can save money and do it quickly. And so from the economic big agriculture perspective, what they value is efficiency. And that's the worldview that they're kind of locked into. And any criticism of that kind of worldview sounds to them as if that's just kind of ignorant about you're kind of ignorant about the best approach to this problem. Now, as Elliot mentions in the book, so if we're thinking about the blind man and the elephant, what perspectives is this company being blinded to? What other perspectives to solve this problem are they being blinded to? And one of the perspectives that they're being blinded to is a local perspective. Right? If you're talking about multinational giant agricultural corporations like Monsanto, whose primary vision of the world is one that's driven by economics and efficiency, then they may be blinded to the effects that their perspective has on local populations. And so this may this may be in some ways culturally ignorant to just say that all we need to do is change the nutrient composition of your rice plants and your problems will be solved. What about the local attitudes? What about the local farmers? What about them? What about their perspective? Doesn't their perspective count in some ways more than the Monsanto perspective? They're the ones being affected. So in some ways we might say, yes, this is a global problem that requires big agricultural, corporations, but it's also a local problem. These individuals, that they have the kind of food you eat is tied up in a lot of cultural practices. And so simply imposing and saying we're going to genetically modify the seeds of these plants, that is in some ways interfering with a potentially very, cherished cultural tradition. So, I think we'd all agree that the kind of food you eat is very much wrapped up in local and cultural practices. Maybe more so in other parts of the world than in the United States, but even in America, we have our own, ways we have food is very tied up with culture. And so the concern is that you're being blinded by your economic efficient perspectives to the needs of the local population who may not want this quick, easy solution. It's not to say that it's this all or nothing approach, right? Because that would defeat the purpose of the elephant story. The elephant story says there are multiple ways to solve problems. The question is, are we being transparent about our values? And are we engaging with other individuals to try to figure out what the best ways to solve problems are? If we're only focused on our perspective and we're not being transparent about it, then we're certainly not engaging, and we're not being transparent about the value influences, the economic influences of big agriculture. Similarly, we could make a case that the local population who is so closed off to the possibility of a big agricultural corporation coming in, if they're just saying, no, this is dead in the water, we don't want you, interfering with our local practices, well, then we might say similarly that they're also seeing this only from their local perspective. And so it's a balance of both, but there could potentially be two ways to study this problem. A balance of the big agricultural perspective and a balance of the local perspective, the local farming practices. And so, this is more of Elliot's argument. The best way to go about how should we study something? We should study something transparently, and we should study something by engaging with others to figure out what other perspectives they can offer about how to study the same problem. Right? So we've got a problem, and then we've got this solution, and this solution, and this solution, and this solution. And the answer, and over here, you can only see the problem from this perspective. Up here, you can only see the problem from this perspective. Over here, you only see the problem from this perspective. But if I ask you, how does that problem look from your perspective? And I ask you, how does that problem look from your perspective? Then we've got a bigger, fuller picture. And so Elliot points out in this chapter that we often think of objectivity as somehow remaining unbiased and neutral. Maybe we wouldn't think that objectivity is the need to take into account as many perspectives as possible. And all Elliot is pointing out here is that, in fact, this broadens our concept of objectivity, so that now we're considering multiple viewpoints, not just one viewpoint. And so that is really kind of the big picture from this chapter. How should we study something? We should study it as many ways as possible. And we should be transparent about the value influences of our particular method so that somebody else can understand, oh, okay, so you're being motivated by an economic perspective. And I can understand your perspective better now because you primarily see the world through an economic lens and an efficiency lens. But I see the world from a local lens. And so now maybe we can talk to each other. Our value influences are now transparent, they're on the table, and we can engage with each other to come up with a better balanced approach about how to study a problem. So that kind of ties Elliot's argument together here. And the only other thing I want to point out is that I really would like you to read from I have an additional reading for this week that really nicely puts the lessons of Elliot's chapter 3 about how we should study something into focus, into a specific case study. So that this is from this, so I have the PDF on Canvas for you to read for this book, and it's chapter 12. The chapter is titled "Excluding Anti-Biotech Activists from Canadian Agri-Food Policymaking: Ethical Implications of the Deficit Model of Science Communication." And so what this author Kelly Bronson did was he actually conducted interviews with the local population in Canada about their perspectives about how is it that these big agricultural corporations were communicating with them. And I think it's very much related to the example from Elliot about the golden rice. And it's very revealing about how it is that these big agricultural corporations think. They think from their perspective. And they think that anyone who doesn't share their perspective is somehow just lacking the right information, that they are somehow ignorant. And of course, that goes back to the deficit model from the other chapter from this book that we talked about. So remember that this book as a whole is titled Ethics and Practice in Science Communication. And so this kind of provides the communication perspective on it. But what's sort of implicit in this question about how should we study it, if how you should study it is your way or the highway, so to speak, then what you're presupposing is that somebody who doesn't agree with you somehow just lacks the right information, and that if they just understood your perspective, they would agree with you. And it's that deficit model again, where the expert knows best and the ignorant layperson doesn't know any better. And so Elliot, in some ways, is saying that the big agricultural corporations are using this deficit model to try to communicate with these local activists. And he shows the failure of that kind of model of communication. And so I really encourage you to do this extra reading for this week, because I think I really enjoyed reading it when I read it this summer when I was trying to figure out what I was going to read for the class. It's really telling about how local attitudes are really just largely discounted almost entirely by these big agricultural corporations. And it's just kind of a case study, and he goes around and he interviews the local activists about how they feel, right? So anyways, I was going to read something to you from it, but I can't find what I can't find what I need at the moment. But this reading goes along so well with this Elliot reading, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it. Anyways, that's all I have for this week.